At the Carlton Grand Theatre, a blind boy mopping backstage was mocked by a world-famous pianist. Hours later, that same boy sat at her piano, and played a song that would shake the world. This is the story of Micah Carter, and what happened the night talent proved stronger than titles. The Carlton Grand Theatre in downtown Atlanta pulsed with elegance that night, crystal chandeliers, red velvet carpets, tuxedos brushing against sequins and silk. But behind the curtain, in the dim maze of backstage corridors, a very different world unfolded. It was filled with the clang of equipment, quick footsteps, and the sweat of unseen labor. No one paid attention to the small, quiet boy sitting in the shadows near the loading dock. And perhaps that was their first mistake. Micah Carter was just 8 years old, slight and solemn, his smooth dark skin catching soft glimmers of the industrial lights overhead. His sightless eyes remained fixed forward, unmoving, but he was listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. The vibrations in the floorboards when the concert grand was tested. The sharp scrape of chairs in the orchestra pit. The crisp ping of a tuning fork. He soaked it all in. Beside him, his mother Angela worked quietly, mopping sweat-stained footprints off the back hall tiles. She had asked the sitter to come, but at the last minute, they cancelled. Rather than leave her blind son alone in their cramped apartment, she brought him along to her evening shift. Angela wasn't supposed to, but she told herself, he'd just sit. Just listen. Micah leaned his head toward the stage, toward the piano. "Mama," he whispered, "can I go closer?" Angela stiffened. She looked toward the stage manager, a gruff man with a clipboard and fraying patience, then back at her son's face, filled with quiet longing. "All right, baby," she said softly, and helped him to his feet. Micah walked like he could see, but he couldn't. His hands brushed the walls and cables until they found the edge of the piano's massive body, cool, sleek, magnetic. He gasped gently, reverently. It was like meeting a long-lost friend. With a careful hand, he traced the polished wood, then hovered his fingers above the keys. He didn't press. Not yet. That's when the footsteps came, hard, fast, sharp. "Who let this thing touch my piano?" The voice stabbed through the air like broken glass. Micah froze. Angela dropped the mop. Vivienne Devoir swept in like a storm in designer heels. Her ivory blouse glistened, and her blonde hair was twisted into a perfect knot. Her lips curled with disgust as she stared at Micah like he was vermin. Angela moved to speak, but Vivienne wasn't done. She slammed the piano lid closed with a crack that echoed off the walls. "Do you have any idea what this instrument is worth?" she hissed. "That thing," she gestured to Micah, "shouldn't even be in this building." Micah shrank slightly, not from fear, but confusion. Angela stepped forward. "He wasn't hurting anything," she said, voice trembling but firm. Vivienne sneered. "Filth like this doesn't understand value. You people never do." Micah turned his head slowly. "I can play," he said softly. Vivienne blinked, thrown for a moment. Then a wicked smile curled her lips. "Can you?" she purred. "Then why don't you prove it? Play tonight, right here, in front of everyone." Angela gasped. "No, please." Micah spoke again. Louder this time. "All right. I will." Micah's words fell like a stone into still water. The air backstage went still. Even the hum of tech crews paused for a beat too long. Vivienne let out a delighted, venom-laced laugh. She turned to a nearby assistant and snapped, "Get him on the list." A little comic relief before the main act, why not? Angela tried to object, but Micah reached for her hand, calm and steady. "It's okay, Mama," he said. "Let them hear me." Backstage murmurs trailed after them as Angela led her son back to the bench where he'd been waiting. Her hands shook as she tucked the collar of his sweater back into place. Her voice was low, but fierce. "You don't owe them anything." "I know," Micah replied. "I'm not doing it for them. The next hour crawled by with cruel deliberation. Every minute was another grain of anxiety falling into Angela's chest. Stagehands whispered. Musicians walked past with curious glances. Someone chuckled as they said, "He's gonna bomb." Poor kid. Micah didn't flinch. Vivian performed first. She played with elegance and force, a display of mechanical perfection. Every note was exact. Her fingers moved like gears in a luxury watch, glittering, cold, impersonal. The crowd applauded dutifully, as they were supposed to. But not a single soul stood. Then came the moment she'd been waiting for. She stepped up to the microphone, faux sincerity dripping from every word. "Before our evening continues, I thought we'd indulge a sweet little moment backstage, a young, blind boy who believes he too can play." She paused, letting the audience chuckle. "So let's welcome Micah Carter." The lights shifted. A stagehand motioned from the wing. Angela turned to her son. "You don't have to do this." Micah tilted his head toward the direction of the piano. "Yes, I do." He walked out alone. The audience's chuckles hadn't fully died. Someone whispered, "Is this part of the gala?" Another laughed, "He's so tiny." Another voice muttered, "What's he wearing?" Vivian, standing just off stage, called out sweetly, "Careful, sweetheart. That piano cost more than your apartment building." Laughter rippled across the room. The spotlight hit Micah full on. The boy in a plain navy sweater and worn sneakers stood like a figure misplaced on the grandest of stages. He felt the heat of their judgment, but not their faces. Micah sat down, took a breath, and placed his hands gently above the keys. Then, he played. Not with flourish, not with fanfare, but with heart. The first notes were soft, uncertain, but honest. They hung in the air like truth whispered in a quiet church. Then they deepened. Grew. Built. The melody didn't belong to anyone but him. It wasn't a recital piece. It wasn't memorized. It was born, live, from the place where pain and hope meet. And suddenly, the room changed. The audience stilled. The murmurs stopped. Somewhere, a wine glass went untouched in midair. The sound of Micah's music was raw, trembling, beautiful. The kind of sound you couldn't fake or teach. The kind that bypassed ears and landed directly in the soul. Vivian stood frozen behind the curtain. Her arms dropped to her sides. Her smirk vanished. Angela, at stage left, had a hand over her mouth. Not to muffle sadness, but awe. The boy they came to laugh at had become the artist they didn't know they needed. And Micah? He didn't hear applause yet. He didn't hear tears or whispers. He only heard the keys, each one a door he was opening into a world that was finally listening. As the last note lingered in the air like smoke, the theater held its breath. Then, from the middle of the crowd, someone stood and began to clap. At first, it was just one man, middle row, silver hair, dark suit, standing tall and clapping slowly. Then another joined. And another. Within seconds, the wave swept through the theater like a sudden storm. 1,000 hands clapping in unison. No one moved to leave. No one spoke. The standing ovation was not out of politeness, it was reverence. Vivian remained rooted at the side of the stage, her arms limp, lips slightly parted. Her carefully crafted night had slipped through her fingers and been rewritten by the very child she tried to humiliate. She had wanted a spectacle. She got one, just not the kind she could control. Micah sat still for a few moments, chest rising and falling, his breath unsteady but his back straight. He didn't bow. He didn't even smile. He simply stood, feeling the floor beneath him, the applause above him, the truth around him. The spotlight felt warm now. Not blinding, but clarifying. Angela rushed onto the stage and wrapped her arms around him from behind. Her tears soaked into his shoulder as the roar of the crowd continued. "You did it, baby," she whispered into his ear, her voice trembling. "You really did it." And then came the sound of footsteps, measured, intentional. From the shadows behind the orchestra pit, a man emerged. Mid-60s, salt and pepper hair, gold lapel pin. Some in the crowd gasped in recognition. Donovan Cade. Billionaire philanthropist. Founder of the Cade Institute of Music. A legend in the world of the arts, and a man who rarely showed up to anything in person. Angela's eyes widened. Vivian turned as if to greet him, smoothing her expression, but he didn't glance at her. His eyes were fixed on Micah. He walked to the center of the stage, crouched slightly, and extended his hand to the boy. "Micah, my name is Donovan," he said, voice low but clear. "And I want you to know, I've heard music in every corner of this world. But I've never heard anything like that." Micah reached forward, unsure at first, then touched the man's hand. Their grip met. Firm. Steady. Donovan straightened, turned to the audience, and lifted his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've just witnessed a moment in history." The crowd roared again. Applause, cheers, even a few shouts of Micah's name. Someone called out, "Does he have a sponsor?" Another added, "Put him on next year's program." Donovan raised a hand for quiet. Effective immediately, Micah Carter will receive a full scholarship to the Cade Institute. That means tuition, housing, instructors, mentorship, everything. And more importantly, he looked at Angela, his family will be supported too. Because talent like this deserves room to grow. Angela's knees buckled. She clutched Micah tightly, breath catching in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Donovan smiled. "I think I do." That's when Vivian stepped forward, her voice tight and brittle. "This was my concert," she said, trying to summon the haughtiness that once silenced rooms. "That piano was meant for my encore." Donovan turned to her, expression calm, unbothered. "Then you should have played something worth remembering." The line hit harder than a slap. Vivian stood frozen, unable to summon a retort. The audience didn't even boo. They simply looked away. A theater full of turned backs said more than words ever could. With a last, stilted glance at Micah, she stormed off the stage, the click of her heels echoing like a retreat. Micah, still holding his mother's hand, turned toward the invisible crowd. He couldn't see them. But for the first time in his life, he could feel them seeing him, not as a burden, not as an oddity, but as a musician. And just like that, the boy who had sat in silence behind a mop bucket became the center of a national conversation. But his journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The performance spread like wildfire. Someone had captured the entire moment on their phone, Micah's hesitant walk to the piano, Vivian's cruel remarks, and most of all, the song that left 1,000 elites holding their breath. The video hit the internet that same night. By morning, it had 3 million views. By the end of the week, it had 50. Talk shows called him the blind prodigy. News anchors described him as the boy who silenced a symphony hall with a single note. Influencers reposted the footage with captions like, "Raw talent the world tried to overlook," and, "Don't ever underestimate a janitor's kid." But amid the sudden spotlight, Micah remained grounded. Angela made sure of that. Despite the whirlwind of interviews, scholarships, and invitations, she reminded him every day, "You weren't made for stages. You were made for truth." That's what they heard that night. Micah spent his days at the Cade Institute now. He practiced for hours, learning not just new pieces, but how to read music through touch, how to compose, how to improvise with an orchestra. Donovan himself took a personal interest in his progress, visiting twice a week to listen, advise, and simply sit beside him in silence. But Micah asked for one thing in return. "I want to help the ones like me," he told Donovan one evening as they sat in the quiet of the Institute's empty recital room. Donovan raised a brow. What do you mean, son? Micah didn't hesitate. The kids no one sees. The ones in the back corners. The ones people laugh at until they're told to clap. I want them to be heard too. Donovan was silent for a moment. Then he placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. Then let's build something that forces the world to look and listen. And they did. Within weeks, the Micah Carter Foundation for Musical Inclusion was born. Its mission was simple: to fund instruments, instruction, and performance opportunities for children with disabilities, especially those from underserved neighborhoods. They started small. A few refurbished pianos donated to schools. A summer workshop in a church basement on the south side. Then came the mobile piano labs, vans equipped with fold-out keyboards and trained instructors, pulling up to rec centers, parking lots, and community centers in forgotten zip codes. Kids who had never touched an instrument suddenly found themselves guided by instructors who believed in their voices. Children who had been dismissed as distractions or burdens were now applauded for their rhythm, their ear, their soul. Angela took on the role of community director. She no longer mopped dressing rooms or fetched coffee for musicians who couldn't spell her name. She now stood behind podiums, beside her son, telling their story. Not for sympathy, but for impact. Vivian, meanwhile, had quietly faded into the background. Her concert bookings declined. Sponsorships dropped. When asked in interviews about the Carlton Theatre incident, she often tried to spin the story. I was trying to inspire him to rise to the challenge, she'd say. But the world had seen the truth already. And no spin could drown out the sound of that night. 1 year later, to the day, the Carlton Grand Theatre sent out a formal announcement. Micah Carter would return, not as a guest, not as a sideshow, but as the headliner. And this time, he wouldn't be coming alone. When the announcement was made, the city of Atlanta buzzed. News outlets ran the headline, Micah Carter returns to Carlton Grand, this time as the main event. But beneath the glitz and promotion, something far more powerful was unfolding. Micah had requested that the first 3 rows of the Carlton Grand Theatre be reserved for children like him. Blind, deaf, in wheelchairs, with speech impediments, from neighborhoods where music programs had long since been cut. Dozens arrived that night. Some wore suits far too big. Some wore sneakers and t-shirts. But every single one wore something else, possibility. Micah didn't do rehearsals on the main stage. He didn't want to step into the moment until it was real. He spent the afternoon in a quiet dressing room with Angela, his hands resting over hers, breathing in rhythm, centering. She could feel the electricity humming beneath his skin, a quiet storm building again, but not the storm of defiance from a year ago. This time, it was the sound of legacy in the making. Outside, the theater was packed. Not just with Atlanta's elite, but with people who had watched the video from last year and hadn't forgotten. Teachers. Nurses. Church elders. Taxi drivers. Students. 1,000 seats filled with those who saw something more in Micah than a viral sensation. They saw hope with a heartbeat. Backstage, a young girl approached him. She was 11, with cochlear implants and fingers twitching with nerves. "Are you scared?" she asked in a whisper, as if asking would make her own fear vanish. Micah turned toward the voice. "A little," he said, smiling. "But scared isn't the same as ready." She nodded, absorbing that. Then reached out and touched his hand. "I liked your song. I want to play like you." Micah gripped her hand gently. "No. You'll play like you." Minutes before curtain, Angela fastened the last button of his dress shirt and adjusted the collar. Her hands lingered, trembling. "You walk out there," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "not just for you. Not even just for me. You walk out there for every child who's been told they don't belong." Micah nodded once. "I know." The house lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and introduced him with reverence, not novelty. Tonight's performer needs no introduction, but he deserves one. Please welcome Micah Carter. No mocking. No laughter. Only applause. Micah stepped into the spotlight. His steps were measured, sure. The air was warm with anticipation, thick with respect. He sat at the same piano. The same stage. But everything had changed. He let his hands hover above the keys once more. And then, he played. The first note rang out, soft and luminous, like a dawn breaking inside a cathedral. It wasn't defiance this time. It wasn't rage turned beautiful. It was something gentler, wiser, deeper. The melody unfurled slowly, like a story being whispered across generations. The room leaned in. Breaths were held. Even the lights above seemed to still themselves. Micah wasn't proving anything now. He was offering something. The children in the front rows sat motionless, their eyes wide or ears pricked or hands vibrating with emotion. One boy on crutches tilted forward with his chin resting on the handle, mouth slightly open. A girl in a wheelchair closed her eyes and rocked to the rhythm. A young boy who couldn't speak clutched his chest and smiled. And still, Micah played. His fingers danced, yes, but not in the way Vivian's had. His music wasn't cold. It breathed. It sighed. It pulsed with life. Every rise of melody was a memory. Every fall of harmony a prayer. He wasn't playing a song. He was letting the world hear his soul without translation. Somewhere in the audience, a woman sobbed openly. A man clutched his wife's hand tighter. And backstage, Angela pressed both palms to her mouth as tears spilled over her cheeks. But she didn't cry because of the music. She cried because of what it meant. Her son had not only survived, he had transformed. When the final note faded, the silence was vast, sacred. The kind of silence where no one dares to speak, not because they don't have words, but because words no longer matter. Then it came. Thunderous, heartfelt, undeniable applause. People rose again, like a tide pulled upward by awe. But Micah didn't rise yet. He simply sat still, breathing, feeling, knowing. This was his world now, not given, not borrowed. Claimed. When he finally stood, he didn't bow. He turned toward the front rows, toward the children who had never been allowed in those seats before. He raised his hand, not in triumph, but in invitation. And they stood, one by one, unsure, hesitant, until the entire front section, children who had been pushed to the back their whole lives, were standing with him. The rest of the audience followed. It was no longer about Micah. It was about what he had unlocked. What he had dared to begin. The curtain never truly fell that night. Even after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, something remained in the air, a hum, an afterglow, as if the theater itself was reluctant to forget what had just happened. Micah exited the stage slowly, his fingers still tingling from the keys, his breath calm, controlled. Angela met him in the wings and folded him into her arms. For once, she didn't say a word. She just held him. Later, in the theater lobby, Donovan Cade stood beside a tall easel draped in black velvet. The crowd had begun to gather again, murmuring, unsure of what came next. Micah, in his simple navy jacket, stood beside Donovan, with Angela at his side and the same group of children now surrounding him. Donovan stepped forward and cleared his throat. "This theater has long celebrated the best in music," he said, his voice carrying through the marble atrium. "But tonight, it must also become a place that remembers." He pulled the velvet cloth away. Beneath it was a bronze plaque mounted on a smooth piece of oak. It read, "In honor of Micah Carter, who played what couldn't be spoken, and taught us all to listen." A stillness swept through the room again, the kind of quiet that came not from shock, but from reverence. Reporters were there, of course. Cameramen. Music critics. But no one shoved forward. No one shouted. They stood silently, some wiping their eyes, others nodding as if privately acknowledging something they had long forgotten. But that plaque was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, the Micah Carter Foundation exploded in growth. National sponsors stepped in. Former music legends offered to teach masterclasses. New chapters opened in Detroit, Chicago, Oakland, and New Orleans. Every piano delivered bore a small inscription etched into the wood, "Every key tells a story." Angela transitioned into National Outreach Director. She no longer wore aprons and scrubbed marble floors. Now she wore tailored blazers, stood before crowds, and told the story of a blind boy with nothing but a song in his heart, and the fire to share it. And Micah? He remained himself. He practiced daily. He still walked barefoot sometimes to feel the vibrations in the floor. He still asked more questions than he answered. He refused a record deal at 12, telling the label executive, "I'm not done learning yet." What he did accept was an invitation to perform at Carnegie Hall, on his terms. And for that performance, he made one condition: half the seats would be filled with children, educators, and single mothers who couldn't afford to attend otherwise. He didn't want silence between pieces. He wanted laughter, joy, curiosity. He didn't want reverence. He wanted revolution. One afternoon, during a quiet rehearsal at the Cade Institute, a young boy entered the room. He was 6, in leg braces, shy, with a nervous fidget in his hands. "Are you the boy from the video?" he asked. Micah, now 12 and taller, turned toward the voice. "Depends," he said gently. "You like the music?" The boy nodded. "Then yeah. That was me." The boy shuffled closer. "I wanna learn." Micah patted the piano bench. "Then sit down. We'll start now." Because the world had once tried to define him by what he couldn't do. But Micah Carter had rewritten that narrative note by note, until the only sound that remained was possibility. Some stories live in silence until someone dares to play their truth out loud. Micah Carter didn't just play the piano, he opened doors that had been locked for generations. His story reminds us that real greatness doesn't need permission. It only needs the courage to begin. If this story moved you, subscribe to True Echo for more powerful, real-feeling stories that inspire, awaken, and remind us what truly matters. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment that could change your perspective, and don't forget to comment and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.